You don't look like you belong in first class. Let's not make a scene. Just tell me whose ticket you stole, and we'll figure it out quietly." That's what the flight attendant said to him, her voice steady, sharp, and loud enough for the other passengers to hear, as if humiliation was part of her training and public shame was just a tool in her belt. She didn't lower her voice. She didn't ask for clarification. And she certainly didn't pause to consider that the 12-year-old black boy sitting calmly in seat 3A might actually have every right to be there. He wasn't causing a disturbance, wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary, unless sitting quietly, dressed in a navy blazer and khakis, while reading a book on climate science, counted as suspicious behavior now. And the boy? His name was Jalen Harris. He didn't yell, didn't argue, didn't burst into tears, although no one would have blamed him if he had, instead. He sat there with his hands folded around the boarding pass he'd shown twice already, his eyes wide, his breath tight in his chest, and his voice held steady behind lips that had learned early to stay calm when dignity is questioned in public. Before I take you through what happened on Delta Flight 2723 from JFK to San Francisco, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state below. If you've ever known someone who faced quiet injustice, the kind that wounds the spirit, not the skin, and you believe stories like Jalen's need to be heard, hit like, subscribe, and let's make sure they're not swept away like crumbs off a tray table. Now, let's rewind just a bit. It was a cool spring morning, just past 8:15 a.m. When passengers began boarding the flight, Jalen had been dropped off early at JFK Airport by his aunt, who had taken time off from work to help him check in for his solo flight across the country. The boy wasn't on vacation. He wasn't headed to Disneyland or visiting cousins. He was traveling to San Francisco to represent his school and his city at the National STEM Junior Symposium, a highly competitive science competition that brought together some of the brightest kids in the country. Jalen had spent nearly 6 months developing a machine learning model to forecast weather patterns using satellite imagery and was set to present his findings to a panel of NASA scientists and professors from Stanford and MIT. His father, Isaiah Harris, a former Air Force officer turned tech CEO based in D.C., had personally booked the ticket through his company's corporate account. Using the airline's verified priority program, Jalen wasn't flying as an unaccompanied minor. The rules allow minors 12 and up to fly independently on domestic routes, and everything had been checked twice. From his ID to the itinerary, Jalen carried with him a slim leather backpack with his laptop, charger, chess book, and a neatly folded document folder labeled STEM Finals Presentation. When he reached the gate and scanned his pass, the green light blinked without issue. He thanked the agent, walked down the jet bridge, and stepped onto the plane with the kind of quiet excitement only a child with a dream and a deadline could understand. That's where he first encountered Carol Myers, the lead flight attendant that morning. Carol, a white woman in her late 30s, had been with the airline for nearly 16 years and was known by coworkers for her efficiency, sharp memory, and a reputation for keeping things in order. A phrase that, depending on whom you asked, was either a compliment or a warning. The moment she saw Jalen approach the first-class cabin, her eyes narrowed. "You're in first class?" she asked flatly. One hand on the seat divider as if protecting some invisible line, Jalen answered politely, "Yes, ma'am. Seat 3A," and offered his boarding pass again. Carol took it without a word, holding it up to the overhead lights like she was checking for watermarks. "Where's your parent or guardian?" she asked next. Still not moving, Jalen answered with quiet certainty, "I'm not flying with one. My dad booked the flight through his business account. I'm going to a science competition in San Francisco." Carol's expression didn't change. She handed back the ticket without apology and gestured toward the seat, but her eyes followed Jalen all the way as he moved down the aisle. Sitting in 3B, The seat next to Jalen's was a retired veteran named Robert Miles, a white man in his late 60s with kind eyes and a weathered face. He nodded at Jalen as the boy settled in, remarking softly, "Big day ahead?" And Jalen, adjusting his bag under the seat, smiled and replied, "Yes, sir." But not even 5 minutes later, Carol returned, without warning. She stood over Jalen's row and said, loud enough for passengers nearby to hear, "Excuse me, I need you to come with me. There seems to be an issue with your seating assignment." Jalen looked up, confused. "But I already checked in and scanned." "Just come with me," she interrupted, already reaching for his small bag in the overhead bin. "We'll sort this out in the back." That was when David Parker, a first-class passenger across the aisle, leaned toward his wife and muttered, "Entitlement starts earlier every year." Linda Parker, sitting next to him, lifted her phone discreetly, not to help, just to record. Jalen stood slowly, clearly embarrassed, but still calm. "Ma'am, I'm sure this is just a mistake," he said, his voice steady, as he followed her toward the galley. And in that moment, a child removed from his seat in silence, while holding a fully paid ticket. The cabin grew quiet in that uneasy, unmistakable way that only happens when everyone senses something is deeply wrong, but no one wants to be the first to say it. As Jalen stood silently near the galley, his small black bag now resting awkwardly beside the beverage cart, the sense of displacement began to settle in his chest like cold air filling a room that used to feel safe. And although no one had physically touched him, the way Carol had removed him from his seat, without verification, without apology, and without giving him a chance to speak, left a mark that was far more painful than any shove or push ever could have been, especially at his age, especially while doing everything right. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. And he certainly didn't push back, not because he agreed with what was happening, but because he knew better, because his father had taught him that in certain rooms, at certain moments. Your calmness is your shield, your silence is your strength, and the truth will have to carry itself until someone decides to finally see it. As Carol tapped her tablet screen with forced authority, mumbling something about a discrepancy in the manifest, the seconds stretched into minutes, and the quiet pressure of eyes from both the passengers in first class and the flight attendants who passed by without acknowledging him began to wear thin on Jalen's composure. Behind him, passengers continued boarding, unaware that a child had been displaced from his seat because someone decided he didn't look the part, and a few rows up, Robert Miles leaned into the aisle, trying to catch a glimpse of what was happening. But when Carol noticed his concern, she quickly pulled the curtain shut, as if that thin blue fabric could conceal the rising discomfort in the cabin. A few feet away, Tina Ramos, the younger flight attendant assigned to assist in first, stood by the coffee station pretending to organize cups, but her hands were shaking slightly, and her eyes flicked to Carol and then to Jalen, clearly uncomfortable but unsure if it was her place to speak. From her posture alone, you could tell she knew something wasn't right. And yet, like so many others in those moments, she stayed still, hoping someone else would step in. Jalen looked down at his phone, not to scroll or text, but just to anchor himself, to do anything but cry or let his voice tremble in front of people who had already made up their minds. A part of him wanted to say something, to demand an explanation, but another part, the one shaped by years of quiet lessons about how black boys are often perceived in public, told him to keep breathing, stay calm, and wait it out. He whispered softly, almost too quiet to hear, "I just want to go to my presentation." And those words hung in the air with more grace than most adults could muster in the face of public embarrassment. Moments later, Elena Zhang, a first-class passenger and civil rights attorney seated in 2C, stood up and gently approached Carol. "Excuse me," she said in a calm, measured voice. "I watched him board. His ticket scanned correctly. You might want to double-check the manifest before removing a minor from a paid first-class seat." Carol didn't make eye contact. "Ma'am, we're verifying some information right now," she replied, her tone clipped, her fingers still dancing over the touchscreen as if trying to justify her own assumptions with technical jargon. Elena didn't push, not yet, but her expression shifted, and it was clear she would be documenting every detail of what was unfolding. From her seat in row 4, Chloe Harper, a lifestyle vlogger with nearly 400,000 subscribers on YouTube, had already begun recording. Her phone angled just above the seat back, capturing everything from the tension in Jalen's posture to the nervous glances exchanged by the cabin crew. Meanwhile, David Parker, still in 3C, leaned slightly toward his wife Linda and muttered, "You know what this is? Some diversity handout nonsense gone wrong. He probably found that ticket in the trash." Linda chuckled softly but kept her phone up, recording with a smug look as if she were documenting a prank, rather than a humiliating moment for a child who had done absolutely nothing wrong. At that point, Jalen gently raised his hand, not aggressively, but the way a student might when asking for permission to speak, and said, "Ma'am, I'd like to request that you recheck my name and seat with the gate before this goes any further. I'm not flying as an unaccompanied minor. My name is Jalen Harris. I'm attending the National STEM Junior Symposium in San Francisco, and my father booked my ticket through his business account. This isn't a mistake." His voice didn't shake. His words were measured, intentional, and deeply respectful. But there was no mistaking the pain behind his eyes. Not fear, not shame, but the sadness that comes from knowing you're not being treated like the others, even when you've followed every rule. Carol blinked, looked up, and said nothing. Instead, she turned to the intercom and called for a gate agent to join her for a passenger verification issue, using code language that made the situation sound like it was a security concern, rather than a misjudgment on her part. In that moment, Amira Patel, the flight supervisor who had just boarded after assisting a delayed transfer flight, entered the front cabin and immediately sensed the tension. She saw the curtain drawn, Jalen standing near the galley, and Tina's uncomfortable stillness, and she stepped in with authority. "Carol, what's going on?" she asked, her voice low but direct. Carol explained the discrepancy and the potential ticket error, but Amira narrowed her eyes and looked directly at Jalen. "Can I see your boarding pass, please?" she asked kindly. Jalen handed it to her. Amira scanned it, confirmed seat 3A, checked the manifest herself, and found his name listed exactly where it should be. She looked back at Carol and asked plainly, "So what exactly is the issue here?" Carol responded. "He said he wasn't with a guardian, and we had a missing parent flag on the system." Amira took a breath, turned to Jalen, and said gently, "You're absolutely fine. You'll be back in your seat in just a moment." And with that, she turned to the gate agent now arriving with a puzzled look and said, "We've got it covered." But as Amira began to walk Jalen back to his seat, Carol leaned in and said, just loud enough to be heard, "You're making this a bigger deal than it needs to be. He's a child. Mistakes happen." Jalen didn't respond. He just looked straight ahead, his mind already racing with questions, not just about what had happened, but about why. And deep down, he knew the answer. He didn't have to say it. The way she'd looked at him had said it all. He returned to seat 3A, but something had shifted. He was no longer just a boy going to a science competition. He was a quiet reminder to everyone watching, and especially to one flight attendant. That dignity isn't earned through age or income. It's a right. And today, it had been violated. As Jalen sat back down in seat 3A, still clutching the now creased boarding pass like it was his last line of defense. The cabin air felt heavier than before, and though the curtain to the galley had been pulled back and the seats around him had returned to their quiet shuffle of overhead bin closures and magazine flipping, there was a new layer of tension, the kind that made people look up for a second too long and then quickly look away. He didn't say a word, as Amira gave him a slight nod before walking back toward the front. Nor did he make eye contact with Carol, who stood stiffly behind her service station, avoiding the gaze of everyone who had just witnessed her mistake unfold. Instead, Jalen leaned his head back against the seat and stared up at the panel of lights and vents above him, forcing his mind to focus on something, anything, other than the burning feeling in his chest. And that's when the memory came. Not a loud or dramatic one, but a quiet, powerful moment from just 4 nights ago, when he and his dad were in the living room of their modest D.C. townhouse, the TV muted, the coffee table covered with note cards and printed diagrams. Jalen had been pacing barefoot across the carpet, reciting lines from his STEM presentation, occasionally stopping to adjust his slides or check pronunciation on a scientific term. And Isaiah, dressed in an old Air Force hoodie and jeans, sat on the couch with his laptop open but his attention fully on his son. "Remember," Isaiah had said, setting the laptop aside and leaning forward. "You don't need to sound smart. You already are. Just make them feel like they're learning something new." Jalen had nodded, but there had been a trace of doubt in his eyes, not about the science, which he knew inside and out, but about the moment itself, about whether he would be taken seriously as a 12-year-old kid walking into a room full of adults with PhDs and press badges. Isaiah saw it too, because after a long pause, he added something softer. "Look, I know you're going to be the youngest one there. And yes, you'll be one of the only black kids in the room. But that doesn't make you smaller. That makes you unforgettable. So if they stare, let them. If they doubt you, let your work speak. And if someone ever questions your right to be in a room, don't shrink. Stand. And if your voice shakes, speak anyway." That night, Jalen had nodded again, but this time with something more solid behind his eyes. Not arrogance, but belief. The kind of belief that only takes root when someone has loved you enough to plant it over years of early mornings, chess games, science fair projects, and long talks about character. Back in the cabin, Jalen reached into his backpack and pulled out the small, spiral-bound presentation book he'd printed and laminated by hand. The title: Satellite-Assisted Climate Modeling, Forecasting Future Drought Zones, was written in bold blue font across the cover, and his fingers instinctively flipped through the pages until he reached the one he always paused on before big moments: a map of sub-Saharan Africa, overlaid with his own heat index algorithm, something his father had encouraged him to focus on, not just because it was impressive, but because it mattered. He stared at the page until his heartbeat slowed down, until the noise around him faded again into something manageable, and just as he closed the book and placed it gently in the seat pocket in front of him, he heard David Parker whisper once again, this time not to his wife, but to the man in 4A. "I give it 10 minutes before they move him again." That line didn't even sting. Not really. It just sat there, like another piece of static in the background, insignificant in comparison to the voice Jalen carried in his mind, his father's voice, steady, calm, reminding him of who he was and why he was there. He turned his head toward the window and watched the crew on the tarmac loading luggage into the underbelly of the plane, thinking about the irony of it all, how his father had told him that flying alone would be a test of maturity, how he had joked that no one ever comes back from San Francisco the same because it's the city of ideas, and how Jalen had smiled and replied, "Maybe I'll come back taller," to which Isaiah had grinned and said, "Or maybe just stronger." In that moment, Jalen wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised. What he felt was something deeper, more reflective. A calm disappointment that this kind of moment still had the power to happen, even in a place where people were supposed to be judged by their tickets, not their appearance. Tina, the younger attendant, came by quietly and offered him a ginger ale without making eye contact, and he accepted it with a soft, "Thank you." Even though he wasn't thirsty, even though his throat still felt like it was wrapped in something tight. She hesitated for a second, as if she wanted to say more, but then turned and walked back to the galley, her posture low, her face unreadable. In row 2, Elena pulled out a notepad and began jotting down bullet points, her legal mind already outlining timelines and discrepancies. And in row 4, Chloe reviewed the video she had captured earlier, replaying the moment Carol had pulled the bag from the overhead bin and ordered Jalen to stand, debating whether she should post it to her followers right away or wait until the situation fully unfolded. Meanwhile, Amira reviewed the manifest again, highlighting Jalen's name and tapping the crew roster with a narrowed gaze, and Carol stood rigid at the jump seat, flipping through her manual with the kind of urgency that wasn't about rules, but about saving face. The plane hadn't even pushed back yet, and already something irreversible had happened. Not just a seating mistake, not just a policy error, but a break in something much more important: trust. Jalen didn't know what was coming next, but he knew what he had to do: remain still, remain respectful, and if it came to it, call the one person who always picked up, who always believed him, and who had told him time and time again, "You never need to raise your voice when the truth is on your side. Just hold the line, and if the line moves, call me." As the last of the passengers filtered onto the aircraft and the cabin door prepared to close, Jalen sat motionless in seat 3A, his fingers tracing the edge of his presentation folder while the rest of the cabin returned to its usual hum of pre-flight activity, though beneath the surface, a quiet unease lingered like smoke that hadn't quite cleared. Though Amira had verified his ticket and even escorted him back to his seat, the atmosphere hadn't softened. Carol remained rigid, refusing to acknowledge her overstep, while David Parker, seated just across the aisle, continued to whisper condescending remarks to his seatmate, and Tina, though clearly uncomfortable, kept her head low and focused on aligning plastic cups in the beverage tray. It was in that growing silence, a silence that felt more loaded than peaceful, that Jalen finally reached into his pocket and unlocked his phone, his thumbs moving slowly across the screen as he typed out a simple but weighted message. "She moved me again, took my bag, said I didn't belong. I'm back in my seat now, but I think she's trying to find something to make it official." The message went out instantly, and within 20 seconds, the phone buzzed with a reply. "Calling now? Answer." Jalen took a slow breath, made sure his voice wouldn't crack, and swiped to pick up the call, bringing the phone up to his ear just as Carol turned toward the front galley to speak with the co-pilot. "Hey, Dad," Jalen said, his voice low but steady. On the other end, Isaiah Harris's voice came through with quiet intensity, the kind that didn't rise in volume but held firm like a lighthouse during a storm. "Start from the beginning. Don't rush." Jalen nodded, even though no one could see. "When I boarded, the lead attendant, Carol, stopped me at the door. She questioned my ticket, asked about a guardian, even though I explained I'm flying solo. She let me sit down, but then came back later and told me to leave my seat. She took my bag without asking and told me I'd need to be moved until they figured things out." There was a long pause on the line, and then Isaiah's voice returned, colder now. "Did anyone confirm your seat after that?" Jalen replied. "Yes. A supervisor named Amira came in and checked the manifest. She saw my name and walked me back, said everything was fine, but Carol hasn't said a word since. She just keeps pacing. Isaiah exhaled sharply. All right, I'm on my way. I'm calling Delta Corporate first. If this flight hasn't left in 30 minutes, I'll be standing at that gate. Jalen, holding back the emotion tightening in his throat, whispered. She made it sound like I did something wrong. Dad, in front of everyone. His father didn't speak immediately. When he did, his voice was softer than before. You did nothing wrong. You hear me? You sat in the seat that was yours. You stayed calm. You were respectful. And you called me. Which is exactly what you should have done. Jalen nodded again, his eyes now fixed out the window, watching as a service truck rolled past the aircraft nose. Okay, he said. Just hurry. Already in motion, Isaiah answered, then added, Stay in your seat. Don't engage. If anything else happens, text me immediately. The call ended. Jalen slipped the phone back into his pocket and exhaled, just as Elena turned from her seat and quietly asked, Everything all right? He gave a small nod and said, He's coming. Meanwhile, inside the cockpit, Carol was speaking in hushed tones with the co-pilot, Evan Doyle, explaining that there was a questionable ticket situation with a minor whose story didn't quite line up, though she left out the part about removing the boy without following formal procedure or about how Amira had already confirmed the manifest. Evan, more interested in his pre-flight checks than crew drama, simply shrugged and said, If it's handled, it's handled. But it wasn't. Not really. Because just as Michelle Sanders, the gate supervisor, began closing out her tablet manifest, her work phone buzzed, a direct line from Delta's Eastern Corporate Liaison Office. She answered, and within moments, her eyebrows raised, her posture straightened, and her voice turned uncertain. Yes, sir. No, I wasn't informed. I'll go back to the gate immediately. Without finishing her checklists, Michelle exited the jet bridge and began heading back toward the boarding gate. Back in the cabin, Amira had begun to sense that something wasn't sitting right. She walked slowly back toward the jump seat, passing Tina, who glanced up briefly and whispered, I think the kid called someone. Amira raised an eyebrow and quietly replied, Good. Maybe someone who'll finally make this right. As if on cue. Jalen's phone buzzed again, this time with a brief, powerful text from his dad. 5 minutes. Don't move. Jalen read it twice, nodded to himself, and sat upright. He placed his folder neatly on his tray table, adjusted his seatbelt, and folded his hands across his lap. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was waiting. A few rows behind him, Chloe Harper had just posted her first clip online with the caption, Kid gets removed from first class, then calmly reclaims his seat like a pro. Still no apology from crew. Hashtag Jalen deserves better. Hashtag Delta. The post was gaining traction. Not millions of views yet, but enough that a few passengers around her had started whispering about the situation and pulling out their phones to check. Moments later, the cabin phone rang. Carol answered it, and her face went pale. Yes, I understand. Yes, I'll inform the crew. She hung up slowly, then turned and saw Amira already watching her. That was corporate, Carol said, her voice quieter than before. Apparently, someone is on their way to the jet bridge, a guest of high importance. They're asking for full access to the cabin. Amira didn't blink. Who is it? Carol's lips thinned. Isaiah Harris. Tina, listening nearby, gasped softly. The Isaiah Harris? From Horizon Global? Carol didn't answer. Instead, she turned slowly and walked toward the front cabin door, trying to reassemble her composure. But it was too late. The ripple had started. And at the center of it all sat Jalen, quiet, patient, composed, not because he didn't feel the weight of what had happened, but because he knew exactly what his father had taught him. that calm in the face of chaos is not weakness, it's power. And today, that power was on its way up the jet bridge. The cabin door hadn't been shut more than a few seconds before the latch clicked again, not with the smooth rhythm of boarding protocol, but with the kind of deliberate pause that made people look up from their phones, their coffee cups, and their conversations. The flight crew turned as one toward the entryway, and standing there, framed by the cool light of the jet bridge and dressed in a gray windbreaker, dark jeans, and scuffed brown boots, was a tall, broad-shouldered black man with a calm, unreadable face and eyes that scanned the cabin with quiet intensity. He didn't shout, didn't demand, didn't stride in like someone who needed to prove anything. Instead, he stepped forward with measured confidence, his gaze moving purposefully down the aisle until it landed on seat 3A, where Jalen sat upright, expression calm but eyes slightly brighter now, his shoulders a little straighter. "Dad," Jalen said softly. Standing up, the man nodded once, a father's nod, full of understanding and restraint, and placed one hand gently on his son's shoulder. "You did the right thing," Isaiah said quietly, and then, after making sure his son was all right, he turned toward the front of the plane, where Carol and Amira stood frozen, neither of them yet realizing exactly who they were dealing with. "My name is Isaiah Harris," he said, voice steady and polite but unmistakably firm. "I'm here to speak with the crew lead and the gate supervisor immediately." Amira stepped forward. "I'm Amira Patel, flight supervisor. I confirmed Jalen's seating personally. The issue started before I boarded." Isaiah nodded slightly. "Thank you. You handled it with professionalism. I appreciate that." He then turned his gaze to Carol, whose arms were now folded, her jaw tight, as she tried to maintain a semblance of control. "And you are?" he asked. "Carol Myers," she answered, clipped and defensive. "I was simply verifying a potential manifest inconsistency. There was a concern about an unaccompanied minor in first class, which, for safety and liability reasons, required clarification." Isaiah didn't flinch. "And what exactly was that concern based on? Because the booking under Horizon Global Technologies was entered with priority clearance. And my son, the child you removed from his seat without authorization, was traveling with full documentation, a confirmed ticket, and no policy violations whatsoever." Carol stiffened. It wasn't personal. "Sir, these situations happen. I was following standard protocol." "No," Isaiah said calmly, but with a sudden gravity that silenced even the whispering passengers nearby. "What happened here was not protocol. What happened here was bias disguised as procedure. You questioned my son's legitimacy in that seat, not because of a technical error, but because he didn't match your expectations of who belongs in first class." At that, the cabin seemed to grow quieter still. Passengers leaned in just a little, not in a nosy way, but in that collective recognition that something important was being said. "You didn't check with the gate. You didn't ask for identification before pulling him from his seat. You didn't verify with your own supervisor. You acted, publicly, on an assumption, and that assumption was wrong." Isaiah continued, his voice never rising, his tone never breaking. Amira looked at Carol, then back at Isaiah. "Sir, I understand how serious this is. If there's anything I can—" Isaiah turned to her again and said gently, "You stepped in and did the right thing when it mattered. That counts." Michelle Sanders, the gate supervisor, had now re-entered the plane, having received the call from corporate, and was walking briskly toward the front of the cabin. "Mr. Harris," she said, breath slightly short. "I sincerely apologize. I was unaware you were arriving in person." "It's not my arrival that matters," Isaiah interrupted. "It's the fact that a child, traveling for an academic competition, was removed from his seat and humiliated without cause. He reached into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek digital credentials folder, tapping the cover once before showing Michelle the document on his phone screen. Here is the booking receipt, the confirmation under Horizon Global's corporate account, and the direct communication with your Delta liaison for VIP travel coordination. The ticket was issued correctly, and there was never a flag for unaccompanied status. What's more, there's video footage of the removal and multiple passenger witnesses. If I weren't Jalen's father, if I were just another executive flying later today, this would have gone unnoticed, wouldn't it? Michelle's expression darkened with shame. Yes, sir. And I am truly sorry. This isn't how we treat anyone, let alone one of our highest-tier partners. Isaiah nodded, but his eyes remained steady. I don't want a discount. I don't want an apology email. I want accountability. Immediate. I want this entire crew reviewed, and any individual who contributed to this mistreatment removed from this flight and reassigned pending investigation. That includes anyone who stood by and did nothing while my son was being targeted. Carol tried to speak, but Isaiah lifted a hand and said, No, not here. Not now. I'm not interested in excuses spoken louder than behavior. We've all seen enough. A few seats back, Elena Jong stood and handed her business card to Isaiah without saying a word. He took it with a nod. Chloe Harper, who had been quietly filming again, whispered to the woman next to her. That's him. That's the CEO of Horizon Global. No wonder Delta Corporate called the gate, in seat 3A. Jalen sat back down, pulling his presentation folder into his lap. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply looked forward, the tension finally beginning to lift from his shoulders. Isaiah turned one final time toward the passengers and said, To anyone here who watched this unfold and said nothing, I understand your silence, but understand this. Silence doesn't protect the innocent. It just delays justice. He turned to Michelle. Make the call. She nodded, took out her radio, and relayed the message back to the jet bridge. Within 2 minutes, Carol, Evan Doyle, and one other crew member were quietly escorted off the aircraft, replaced immediately by backup crew from standby rotation. No one clapped, no one cheered. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was quieter than that. A moment not for celebration, but for reflection. Isaiah sat beside his son, fastened his seatbelt, and glanced at the laminated page in Jalen's lap. Is that your sub-Saharan drought model? He asked. Jalen nodded. You were right. They stared. I just kept standing. Isaiah placed a hand on his son's back. And I'm proud of you. But this time, you don't have to stand alone. And with that, the plane door closed again, not in anger, not in shame, but with a quiet understanding that something had shifted in the air. By the time the flight crew began preparing for departure again, the atmosphere inside the first-class cabin had changed entirely, not in a loud or chaotic way, but in a heavy, reflective silence that settled over every row like a thin layer of ash after a fire. A silence that followed the quiet removal of 3 crew members, Carol Myers, Evan Doyle, and 1 junior attendant, who were escorted off the plane without protest, their uniforms still pressed, their faces stiff, each of them fully aware that the moment was no longer under their control. No explanations were given over the intercom, no formal announcements were made, but everyone on board understood what had happened. Even those who hadn't said a word during the initial confrontation. Amira remained in place as the acting lead, standing tall with professional composure, while 2 backup crew members from the airport standby list stepped in to assume the open positions, their greetings brief, their tone careful, each of them aware that they were walking into a situation far more delicate than the usual gate delay. Jalen sat quietly in 3A, his laminated presentation folder once again resting on his lap. And this time, no one dared question why he was there. His father sat beside him now, calm but alert, occasionally checking his phone as messages poured in, not just from Delta's corporate liaison team, but from friends, colleagues, even media contacts who had already begun reacting to a video posted less than an hour ago. Across the aisle in row 4, Chloe Harper had uploaded a 2-minute clip to her social media account with the caption, "12-year-old black boy humiliated in first class. But wait until you see who his dad is," in the footage. Carol could be clearly seen removing Jalen's bag from the overhead bin and ordering him out of his seat, while the boy's voice remained calm, respectful, and composed throughout. The video had already surpassed 1.2 million views, with tens of thousands of comments pouring in from all over the country, many expressing outrage, others sharing similar stories, and some just quietly saying, "I see my grandson in him." Chloe didn't say much after that. She didn't need to, but her clip had already made it onto several trending feeds, and by the time the plane pulled back from the gate, hashtags like Jalen deserves better and Delta bias were starting to gain traction across multiple platforms. Meanwhile, back at JFK's Delta Operations Center, a conference room that usually buzzed with routine updates was now in full motion, with executives reviewing the footage, cross-checking flight logs, and drafting a public response that could address the incident without igniting further backlash. Within the hour, Delta issued a formal internal memo stating that the flight crew involved had been removed from rotation pending investigation and that a full review of bias training procedures was underway. The memo didn't name names, but it didn't have to. People already knew. Passengers from other sections of the plane had begun piecing things together, sharing brief posts and subtle photos, most of them not for clout or attention, but as a quiet way to say, "I was there. I saw it too." In row 2, Elena Jang reached into her briefcase and began drafting a formal statement, not as a passenger, but as an attorney, outlining the details of what she had witnessed, including exact timing, tone, and the crew's failure to follow standard policy for handling minor passengers. Robert Miles, the veteran in 3B, simply sat with his arms crossed, offering Jalen the occasional nod of reassurance, and at one point he leaned over and quietly said, "You kept your head better than most grown men I've known. You remember that?" Jalen nodded but said nothing. His eyes focused on the clouds forming beyond the window as the aircraft taxied toward the runway. It wasn't over yet. He knew that. But something had shifted. His voice had been heard, and not because he'd raised it, but because he'd held the line until the right person could help carry it forward. Sitting beside him, Isaiah checked his phone again and saw a notification from Delta's CEO requesting a private meeting post-flight. He smiled briefly, not because of the title or the meeting, but because his son had proven, in front of strangers and without ever losing his composure. That strength doesn't always come from pushing back. Sometimes it comes from simply refusing to move. As the plane began to lift into the sky, a quiet calm returned to the cabin, and for the first time that morning, Jalen reached into the seat pocket, pulled out his notes, and whispered the opening line of his presentation to himself under his breath. Not to prove anything to anyone else, but to remind himself that he was still going to San Francisco, still going to that science competition, and still carrying with him every lesson his father had ever taught him about dignity, preparation, and what it means to stay grounded, even while flying. 2 weeks later, under a soft afternoon sun in San Francisco, Jalen stood on the stage of the National STEM Junior Symposium, wearing a navy blazer just a shade darker than the one he'd worn on the flight, a gold participant medal around his neck, and a quiet confidence in his voice as he explained to a panel of judges how his satellite-assisted drought model could help improve early warning systems for farmers across Africa and parts of the American Midwest. And as he spoke, clearly, calmly, with the same steady tone he'd used when addressing the flight attendant who tried to move him, it became clear to everyone in that room that they weren't just listening to a brilliant young mind, but to a boy who had already learned what it meant to hold his ground in the face of disrespect, to choose grace over anger, and to let his work speak louder than someone else's doubt. Afterward, he didn't win the top prize, he came in third, but when the judges handed him the Excellence in Innovation Award, the auditorium gave him a standing ovation, not just for his research, but for who he was becoming, and for how he had arrived there, sitting in the front row. Isaiah clapped with quiet pride, his phone already full of unread messages from civil rights leaders, educators, and even Delta executives who had followed the story as it gained traction far beyond Chloe's initial post. In the days after the incident, Delta launched a full-scale internal review of how solo minors are treated, issued new crew guidelines under what passengers were already calling the Jalen Protocol, and named Isaiah to an external ethics advisory board aimed at modernizing airline accountability, not just for PR, but because they knew they had missed something important, and that sometimes it takes one boy's silence to make a company listen. Meanwhile, Carol's removal became permanent after video footage and multiple passenger statements confirmed policy violations. And though the airline didn't publicly name her, industry insiders quietly took note. Back in D.C., Jalen's story was shared at school assemblies and youth mentorship events, not as a tale of revenge, but as a story of poise under pressure, a reminder to young people that character isn't about how loud you speak, but how consistently you act when it counts. At one such event, Jalen met Marcus Reed, a 17-year-old who had been seated in economy on that very flight, who had watched everything unfold from a distance but hadn't known how to help. When they met face to face, Marcus said, "You showed me I don't always have to yell to be heard," and later applied for an internship at Horizon Global's Summer Coding Academy, where Jalen would soon be teaching a beginner-level Python class. The ripple kept growing. At another speaking event in Atlanta, Isaiah stood before a crowd of corporate leaders and said, "What happened on that flight wasn't an isolated mistake. It was a mirror, and we can't change what we don't first admit we've ignored." But the most meaningful moment came quietly, just between father and son. On a warm Sunday morning as they walked along the National Mall, Jalen asked, "Did I handle it right? Should I have said more?" And Isaiah stopped walking, looked his son square in the eye, and said, "You didn't need to say more. You stood in truth, and you gave me something no father can buy, the chance to fight beside you, not for you. That's power, and you held it with grace." Jalen didn't reply right away, but the look in his eyes, thoughtful, steady, familiar, said more than words ever could. In the final scene, as they boarded a new flight together bound for Seattle, greeted at the door by a warm and diverse crew who smiled and addressed Jalen by name, the boy looked up at his father and said with quiet humor, "Think they'll let me keep my seat this time?" Isaiah chuckled, resting a hand on Jalen's shoulder. "They'd better. It's got your name written all over it." And as they settled into 3A and 3B, the cabin lights dimmed for takeoff, and the view out the window shifted from tarmac to sky. One truth remained. Not every fight is won through confrontation. Not every seat is reclaimed through shouting. And not every legacy is built in boardrooms. Sometimes it begins in row 3, with a boy who simply refused to shrink, a father who knew when to show up, and a world that finally had no choice but to listen. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, because respect, dignity, and courage, they belong in every seat. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments, what would you have done if this was your child? Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next story.